And welcome, Hoosier fans, to another episode of Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana University basketball news and discussion. I'm your host, Jerod Morris. Podcast on the Brink is a joint production of the Assembly Call and Inside the Hall. For complete coverage of IU basketball, visit assemblycall.com and insidethehall.com. On this week's edition of Podcast on the Brink, Alex Bozich and I are joined by Bart Torvik from BartTorvik.com, who is the man behind the T-Rank college basketball projections. Bart's site provides a unique look at the college basketball landscape, a little bit different than what you'll find at KenPom and some of the other analytics websites, and we talked to Bart about that, about his methodology, and then dive right in talking about the Big Ten. Bart is a Wisconsin fan, so he's got some unique insight on the Badgers, and the Badgers' recent dominance in the IU-Wisconsin series, but he's also just knows a lot about the Big Ten. So we talk about the Big Ten, talk about Indiana, and how the conference race is shaping up heading into next season now that he's run all of his preseason projections. All of that coming on this week's edition of Podcast on the Brink. Buying tickets can be complicated and confusing, but there is a better way to buy with SeatGeek. SeatGeek is the smartest, easiest way to get tickets to every type of live event. Whether you're searching for a last-minute deal, planning a night out with friends, or need to find the perfect gift, SeatGeek helps you find the best seats at the best prices, fully guaranteed. There is nothing quite like being there in person, and SeatGeek will get you closer to the action for a great value. I have the SeatGeek app on my phone, have had it for a couple of years now, and it is by far the easiest way that I have found to shop for tickets because I can be anywhere, and with just a few taps, I can instantly find seats. I would love to use the SeatGeek app to pick up Mavericks playoff tickets this year and see Yogi, but obviously the Mavericks are not in the playoffs. But if you're in Indiana and you want to watch Victor, you want to watch Eric Gordon with Houston, or you want to watch OG with Toronto, or any other NBA playoff games, or any baseball games during the summer, SeatGeek is the way to go because SeatGeek is designed to make your ticket buying experience easier than ever. SeatGeek saves you time and money by searching multiple ticket sites to compare prices and find amazing deals so that you don't have to go through all that legwork yourself. And best of all, listeners to Podcast on the Brink like you get $20 off of your first SeatGeek purchase. All you have to do is download the SeatGeek app and enter the promo code BRINK, B-R-I-N-K, today. That is promo code BRINK for $20 off of your first SeatGeek purchase. And we are joined this week on Podcast on the Brink by Bart Torvik, who is the founder of the T-Rank college basketball projections, which you can find at BartTorvik.com, and that is BartTorvik.com. And he is also a diehard fan of the Wisconsin Badgers, and we wanted to have Bart on to talk about college basketball analytics as well as his outlook for the Badgers next season. And Bart, I just want to begin by saying that in preparation for this interview, I clicked on your About Me link on the website, which I've done before, though apparently I didn't learn my lesson the first time because I ended up being serenaded by Rick Astley. So damn you, but welcome to Podcast on the Brink.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you. So, I found your site for the reason why a lot of college basketball fans find your site, because, I'm a subscriber to KenPom.com, and we reference KenPom numbers a lot on our broadcast, but your website really provided some different views of the data that his site doesn't. For example, the adjusted efficiency ratings in tournament quality games over the last 10 games, and especially last year, this data became compelling to IU fans when Indiana's defensive efficiency rating started to surface in the top 3, top 4, for the data from the last 10 games at one point late in last season, which was something that we were all very excited about. To kind of begin, can you briefly summarize the niche, and I think it's a really valuable one, that your data fills in the college basketball analytics landscape?
Sure. So the basic idea is pretty similar to KenPom. It's adjusted efficiencies, offense and defense, points per possession adjusted for the opponent's strength and venue. And obviously, the KenPom is the leader in that, and is kind of the industry standard, and is the best. And I do that, and that's sort of the backbone for all the other kind of tools that I've kind of come up with and ways to slice and dice the data. Like you said, the last 10 games or against quality opponents, and you can look at, you can look at top 50 or 100 opponents, and you can look at top 50 opponents over the last month, all those kind of different ways. So, and that was just kind of stuff that I was interested in, that I wanted to know that KenPom doesn't allow you to do, and probably for good reason, but that's kind of how it came about for me. I was just curious and I wanted to do it. So I did it. And I think, the reason not to do it is it can be anytime you start slicing and dicing the data, especially in a sport like college basketball, where there's, not that many games. If you're cutting games out, your sample might get smaller and you might get crazier and crazier results, but it's all in good fun, I think. And you can see those trends, like Indiana's defense improving over the course of last year, that you might not otherwise be able to see. And for instance, Archie Miller has that background as a defensive coach, and so it's nice to see as an Indiana fan that you can back it up with some numbers. And so that's kind of the niche, is just sort of playing around, slicing and dicing the numbers, and having fun with them.
So my guess is that most of our audience, is fairly well versed in advanced stats and, uses them as they're kind of assessing what's happening in the season. Why do you think the average college basketball fan should care about tempo-free stats, like adjusted efficiency margins and that kind of thing? What extra insight does that give us into the game?
Well, I think, the thing about college basketball is that there's so many teams. And so it's really hard to compare teams that don't play each other or only have even a couple common opponents. And the teams play such different styles at such different paces, that I think to really compare teams from the West Coast to the East Coast, that some that play, 20 possessions faster per game, you really need tempo-free stats to make a valid comparison. So I think that's why it's such a big deal in college basketball as opposed to the NBA, where tempo-free stats I don't think are as big a deal at the team level because there's a narrower range of styles, really. It's still important there, but it's not as big a deal because there's not as much variety. And I think that's what most college basketball fans will say. One of the great things about the sport is that, you can have different styles, and the different styles clashing in the tournament is one of the great storylines every year. So that's why I think it's really important and interesting in college basketball.
Mm-hmm.
Bart, right now there's obviously a long time to go before anything happens next season. We got till November before the season starts. So one of the fun things I like to do is cruise your preseason rankings. And I'm just curious, and this may be a more in-depth question than we have time to dive into, but I'm just curious kind of when you start, because you had these out, I think right after the season ended, you started working on them and obviously updating them all the time. But how do you maybe start? Like, what's the baseline for going ahead and putting out the projections for next season, and what all goes into that?
Sure. The inputs to the system are basically a little bit of historical performance by the team, and then the returning players and how they performed in the past and kind of their pedigree. If they're basically their recruiting rank. So if you can tell me who's returning and how the team has performed, I can run the system. Obviously, until last week or whatever, when the draft deadline passed, we didn't really know who was returning. And, there will still be transfers that will mix things up. But basically, after the championship game, you can get a pretty good idea of those inputs. 95% or 90% of who's returning to which teams, and how the teams did in the past. That's locked in. So I can run those pretty much right after the season ends, and then it's kind of a fun thing about doing that is then you can see the changes as various things happen. Like if Romeo Langford commits to Indiana, how much does that help? And if they lose somebody through a transfer, how much does that hurt? And so it's just kind of a fun, stock rising and falling thing to track during the off season. So that's, and I can start sort of projecting it as early as, February, but those obviously are even less valid than what I have now because we don't really know how good last year's team was until the season's over, and that's a significant part of the projection.
So I know you obviously are a stats guy, but you also watch games and you have a good feel for the Big Ten at large, I feel like. So when you look at, you put all these numbers in for 2019, and right now I'm on your Big Ten conference page, and you look at it, do any teams maybe stand out to you and say, hey, I maybe don't agree with what my numbers say on this team? Like, to me, Michigan State at number 5, I'm like, they lost Miles Bridges, They lost Jaron Jackson. I'm like, are they really the 5th best team? And then another team I look at is, Iowa. I'm like 28th. I guess how do you kind of reconcile that to, obviously your stats are one thing, but also you see these teams as much as anybody, and kind of your feelings on that.
Yeah. So first of all, I would say when I look at these, I sort of imagine basically a plus or minus 30 spots. That's about how accurate this is in the past. And obviously I try to make it as accurate as I can, but it's more about a general feeling. And I would agree that nobody is going to be ranking Michigan State in the top 5. I've seen some people ranking them in the top 10, borderline top 10, but that's a little high. And I can tell you why they're ranked that high. It's because they've got three 5-star recruits coming back as juniors, which is very unusual. You just don't see that. And 5-star recruits, when they come back, tend to improve a lot. So that's a nucleus that you can definitely build a championship team around. Because, most 5-star recruits end up playing in the NBA, or at least a lot of them do. And it wouldn't, if Michigan State does end up being a top 5 team next year, nobody's going to be like, whoa, I never saw that in a million years with a Hall of Fame coach and 3 5-star guys. But on the other hand, obviously at least one of those 5-star guys hasn't really performed like a 5-star guy yet. And so there's reasons for doubt, and obviously they're losing 2 lottery picks. And, so that's where it comes from. And it's just kind of interesting to me to see where like a objective algorithm can focus on different things than a human being. And it's not that it's smarter than a human being. It's definitely not, but, sometimes we're biased and we focus on what they're losing. They're losing 2 great players, and we don't focus on what's coming back necessarily, which are potentially 3 really good players who could, you could see any of them being, on at least the top 3 of the Big Ten teams. So that's kind of the explanation for Michigan State. But on the whole, my subjective opinion is I agree with you that that's too high. But when I look at this Big Ten page, what it spits out is a bunch of teams projected to go 10-10. So it's kind of thrown up its hands, given the whatever emoji. And I think that on the whole, I kind of agree with that subjectively, I don't have real strong feelings about what's going to happen in the Big Ten next year. There's a case to be made for a lot of different teams, but they all have weaknesses and question marks around them. Iowa, the case for them is that they've got basically everybody coming back, and they're a young team, a lot of sophomore minutes that you would expect to take a leap. That's what my system is seeing, as freshmen who played a lot and were okay, and freshmen who play a lot tend to be even better as sophomores. So that's what they've got, and that's why they're projected where they are. And in the Big Ten as a whole, there aren't a lot of teams that are bringing back a lot. Most teams, I think, lost their best player. The exceptions to that are obviously Wisconsin and Indiana and Iowa and Nebraska. Pretty much everybody else who you'd expect to be a contender lost their best player, if not their 2 best players. So that's why I think it's pretty wide open, and I wouldn't wager a whole lot of money on anything happening in the Big Ten next year.
Bart, you mentioned Romeo Langford earlier. How do you project a freshman like Romeo, who obviously we haven't seen him play yet, but there's the historical precedent of, got McDonald's All-Americans, guys who have been in the top 5. So I'm sure that's part of it. But is there anything where you look at a guy like Romeo and you're like, okay, he's a great scorer, so I'm going to take into account for that? Or is it strictly based on where guys that have been ranked as recruits as him have performed in the past?
It's the latter. It's a pretty blunt instrument. It's just what is their ranking, and then so they're kind of slotted in, and that's what the projections are based on.
Okay.
I haven't been able to I don't have a good source of data for, like the AAU data that I've been able to incorporate to make the more detailed projections that I make for other players. But even those are, they're close, but it's very hard to predict college basketball, which is part of what makes it so fun. And I try and have fun doing it. But, the slot approach to projecting freshmen is about as good as I think you can do. I know that, Dan Hanner, who publishes his projections for Sports Illustrated every fall, does that and does a really good job. His preseason ratings, I think, are easily the best. And he actually, will project points per game for freshmen, and he can take into account some of those team-based issues, like if they're lacking a scorer, a guy like Romeo could come in and fill that void. But I don't do that, and so most of my site is if it's good enough, it's good enough, But Romeo makes a big difference. If you get a top 5 recruit, that's pretty much expected to be a 1-year guy, NBA player, and those guys can really change the fortunes of a team.
I'm curious, from your perspective, being deep in this stuff, and and you're on Twitter, you're very active on Twitter, and I'd recommend everybody follow you on Twitter. So you probably see people citing stats all the time. What do you think is the most overrated, oversighted of the advanced stats, and which one do you think is the most underrated or underutilized?
Well, I guess the one that pops to mind is just tempo, even adjusted tempo. People pay a lot of attention to it, even though we talk about tempo-free stats. People still pay a lot of attention to tempo, and if you have a game where one team is slow and one team is fast, it will always be part of the narrative about who can control the tempo. And in my opinion, it just doesn't matter. It's just not really part of who wins or who loses. It's not part of who plays well or not. And it's not really correlated to offensive or defensive efficiency, which is why it's tempo free. We want to get rid of it, right? But people are still kind of obsessed with it as a stylistic thing. So that's what jumps to mind as far as an overrated stat in tempo-free stats is just plain old tempo. I guess another one would be 3-point defense, which Ken Pomeroy did a pretty seminal study on several years back that concluded that it's mainly just luck. How many shots your opponent makes from 3-point land is you can't really control it. All you can control is how many they take. And you want to try to limit that is kind of the conventional wisdom now. And you see that more and more where teams are trying to limit 3-pointers. And with a few exceptions, whether they go in or not has to do with whether they're guarded. But if they're guarded, if they're open, they tend to go in at a similar rate no matter who you're playing, right? So, if you are guarded,
IU fans just exhaled until they remembered the Fort Wayne and Indiana State games, and then
right, they got off to a bad start last year.
Yeah.
But that explains those upsets, right? That's why underdogs take a bunch of threes, because you're just kind of increasing the variance, and if you have a lucky day, you can take down a giant.
Hey, I'm jumping in here real quick. I'm sorry for bringing up Indiana State and Fort Wayne. I know we all agreed that we wouldn't mention those games again, and here I am in the middle of June on podcast still bringing them up. So I apologize. I won't let it happen again. But I wanted to jump in here real quick. We need to pay a few bills, so we're going to run a couple of ads. Some of you will hear the ads. They'll run right now. Others of you will just jump right into the rest of the conversations just based on the geo-targeting of the ads and however that works. But coming up for the rest of the conversation, Alex has a question, a two-part question for Bart next about Wisconsin's recent dominance over Indiana, and then his outlook on the Badgers, and then we dive in even more to talking about the Big Ten with Bart. So that's coming up right now. Some of you will hear ads. Others of you will jump right into Alex's question, next question for Bart. Here we go.
Bart, I got a two-part question. The first is the one on every Indiana fan's mind, I think, and is when is Indiana going to beat Wisconsin again? And two is just your overall thoughts on the Badgers next season. I think I had a couple of people on my forum when I posted your preseason rankings asked me why Wisconsin was so high, and I actually don't disagree with where you have them just based on the fact that Ethan Happ, in my opinion, is probably the Big Ten preseason player of the year. Maybe Carson Edwards would have an argument for that, and then also the fact that there were so many injuries last year, and they have a ton of talent returning. So kind of your thoughts on the Badgers as well going into next season.
Sure. Yeah. The first part is easy, which is they're never going to beat Wisconsin again, at least not in Wisconsin.
That's true.
That was the one streak that the Badgers kept alive last year, was that they haven't lost Indiana at home since '97, I think, which is when I had student tickets back in the day. So I was at that game, and I've religiously not gone to another Indiana-Wisconsin game while the streak has been alive, and I won't. But obviously that'll end at some point. I think from the Indiana perspective, the hope is that you're kind of entering a new era where you reverse this hex, and because I was born in 1976. I've looked at the stats, and for the first 20 years of my life, I think Wisconsin, I don't know if they ever beat Indiana. I think they won in like 1977 or something like that, but then they lost about 10,000 games in a row. And so, I remember them beating Indiana when Dick Bennett was the coach, and that was just, it was a miracle. It was a great day. And now things have obviously totally flipped on their heads, where Indiana, never beats Wisconsin. It's just very strange. And so you got to figure it'll change at some point. Hopefully we'll just go back to a good rivalry where we kind of trade wins instead of one team always beating the other. I guess I would prefer that Wisconsin always beat Indiana, but that would be my second choice. As to Wisconsin this next season, I think they're one of the many Big Ten teams that has, they've got question marks. My ranking of them at 19th is probably their best case scenario. You could definitely see them being worse, but they've got a lot coming back, including a bunch of sophomore minutes. People who played as freshmen last year and played well, in Brad Davidson and Kobe King coming back from injury, as I think you guys mentioned. Dimitri Trice also coming back from injury. So there's a good case to be made for them to be a good team next year. I would say the question marks are, Bo Ryan's not the coach anymore, and how much of sort of their program strength is predicated on Bo Ryan being the coach. In other words, is Greg Gard good enough? And that the jury's still out on that. I think he's definitely a good coach, but is being a good coach enough to win with this style, enough to win at Wisconsin, to be a contender, to be the second best team in the Big Ten. And I think there's reasonable doubts about that at this point. I personally think he is, but I'm obviously biased. And this year it'll be a fun year because it's kind of put up or shut up, for Wisconsin at this point. And if they don't make the tournament next year, then you got to really think about the future. But I think they'll be at least a bubble team. And it'll be fun to watch, everybody coming back. Obviously Ethan Happ coming back, as you mentioned, probably one of two guys, preseason All Big Ten or preseason Player of the Year. And he's got a chance to break all sorts of records at Wisconsin. So that's one of those things that can make a season fun, even if you don't win all the games, is track it. At least for me, a stats guy, obviously, I like tracking those stats. I've got a special page for it on my site. And so I'm looking forward to that. And there's a lot of question marks, but I'm pretty optimistic.
Bart, going back to the recent dominance of Wisconsin over Indiana, I think as fans, we all naturally have a visceral reaction when we're playing an opponent. You're playing a certain coach and you just know, oh man, okay, this is going to be tough because this coach is there. I'm curious, just your reaction, obviously, when Indiana would come in with Tom Crean, and so many of those losses are under Crean. Is there any difference now that Indiana has Archie Miller? Like, do you just kind of feel viscerally like, okay, this, there's now a more coherent plan on the sidelines, they have a better coach, or is it just, Wisconsin kind of dominates Indiana, and until that changes, we're just going to kind of assume that the winning will keep happening?
I would say the general impression among Wisconsin fans is that Archie is a more formidable opponent than Tom Crean, as far as a game coach. And as far as, Wisconsin fans, we've just been sensitized and bred to respect defense, and if you have a team that just focuses on offense and plays some junk zone, for instance, or something like that, it may be effective, it might work, but Wisconsin fans aren't going to respect it, especially if they beat it all the time. And I would say, I don't know a lot about Archie Miller, and we've only played him once or twice last year, but the reputation and the idea in my head I have of him is of more of a hard-nosed defensive guy, and that's scarier. That's a team that can beat you even not on their best day. And I think that was, my take on Crean was good enough to, he's a great recruiter. He could get guys in. I know he didn't recruit Indiana well enough, maybe for the Indiana fans, but he got a lot of, for Wisconsin fans, great recruiter. And when he had the talent, obviously he had really good teams. Had, one seed, won the Big Ten a couple times, but when they had marginal talent, they just were not good at all. He couldn't extract wins out of mediocre teams. And Archie, I think, can. That's what I suspect, is that their floor is a lot higher under Miller than it was under Crean. And obviously, he's so far shown that he can close the deal on recruits too. So I would say Miller strikes a bit more fear, and in the long run, you will worry that, as a Wisconsin fan, you worry that if they keep getting, McDonald's All-Americans and have a harder nosed coach, that's kind of the Bobby Knight formula a little bit more than Tom Crean. And obviously that's a successful formula.
We're now a few years removed from Bo Ryan being at the helm at Wisconsin, and he's a coach that I think, all Big Ten fans respected. Certainly Indiana fans did, and I'm sure he is held in the highest of esteem with Wisconsin fans. Mm-hmm. How do you reflect now on the Bo Ryan era? Is there any sense of unfinished business, that they didn't get a national championship, or is it, when you reflect back on it, just, almost entirely positive with what he accomplished there?
I would say it's entirely positive. It was a miracle, basically. Bo Ryan's reign at Wisconsin. There's got to be some luck involved, but that's just not that kind of success, and that kind of consistency was mind blowing for someone like me who grew up in an era of, I distinctly remember being in fifth grade and the Badgers making the NIT, and that was a huge accomplishment. So that's where we came from, was making the NIT, being like, let's have a party, to making the NCAA tournament every year, and then culminating in those two Final Four teams, including a team that, I think was one of the best teams not to win a title of this decade and probably of the century. And obviously they had the great win over Kentucky. I went to that Final Four. I was there. That was awesome. The only wistfulness you have about it is that the Duke game, the championship game, was a good game, and they had a lead. They led by 9 points, in the second half. And so it was in their grasp, and then it just slipped away. And that was very painful. And I know a lot of Badger fans can't let it go. For me, I let it go. I just choose to remember the Kentucky game. But and in hindsight, Bo probably should have retired that day. I think took something out of him. I think he was sort of running on fumes at that point, and the next season was almost a disaster because he didn't. I don't know if it was because, but I don't think he was coaching at the same level that next season. But it turned out all right. Obviously Greg Gard came up to the top spot and performed pretty well. But the Bo Ryan era, I guess I would just describe it as a miracle, and I'm not gonna cast any aspersions on it whatsoever.
Bart, as a fan of Big Ten basketball in general, I'm curious for your thoughts on a team next season going into the year that you're most intrigued to see, other than obviously Wisconsin or Indiana that we've talked about. I think you talked a little bit about Michigan State. So maybe other than those three teams, who maybe are you most intrigued to watch next season?
I think some people would say they might be the favorite instead of Michigan State, which I have the favorite. The algorithm has as the favorite. Obviously, they lose a lot. They're losing Wagner and Marr and Robinson, but they've got some exciting young guys too, and a really good recruiting class. And John Beilein has at this point kind of established himself as definitely one of the best coaches in the Big Ten, and the guy you think who's going to maximize whatever talent he has. But on the other hand, they do lose guys, so that's another team where I'll just be interested to see what happens. Do they have the last 2 years they've really gelled? They've at points in the season looked like kind of a bubble team or worse, and then ended up being great at the end of the year. They're another fan base that really likes the ability of my site to slice and dice the data so they can show how good they've been since January 1st. Just forgetting that non-conference season happened, and so we'll see. I don't really believe in the idea that there are certain coaches who magically make teams better in March. It's kind of funny to see how things have turned on Izzo, who used to be considered this March wizard, who would, lose in November in the Champions Classic every year, but then go to the Final Four every year. And now he's, the last 3 years had some tournament failures, and now everybody says, "Oh, this guy can't coach at the end of the year." And, to me, it's just reversion to the mean, right? You get some years you're lucky, some years you're not. So we'll see. The other really interesting team, I think, is Nebraska, a team we haven't talked about because they were pretty good last year. They were one of the teams that the lack of depth in the Big Ten really hurt them because they just couldn't get any wins that the selection committee cared about. But they're bringing back pretty much their whole nucleus. So they should be pretty good. And I think it's a big year, obviously, for Tim Miles. He needs to make the tournament again. So I'll be interested to see what happens with them.
Getting back to Indiana, Bart, obviously, you have right there, or right now, according to your system, they're, one of those four teams that are above the 10-10 morass that sits there in the middle of the Big Ten. And clearly with Romeo Langford and Juwan Morgan, the Hoosiers have a really solid kind of 1-2 punch going into every game. And we've spent a lot of time this offseason dissecting the other guys, Devontae Green, Justin Smith, Deron Davis, the incoming freshman, whose development is going to be so important to Indiana, reaching a ranking of 20, getting back to the NCAA tournament. When you look at the other guys, not named Juwan Morgan and Romeo Langford, do you have strong opinions on any of them, one way or the other, about how important their development is and who might be most likely to make a jump up in production this year?
Yeah. I like Deron Davis. I think he's a good player. And I think as a complementary guy, as a third guy is potentially a really good player. So I think they've got the pieces, and that's what my projection system sees is they've got stars, Morgan and Langford, and then they've got a number of guys who can play, and you'd expect to improve. Justin Smith being one of these typical guys who was solid as a freshman. I think he was a pretty highly rated recruit, so you'd expect him to be even better as a sophomore. So I see a lot of pieces there. They obviously they lost a few guys, but unlike most of the Big Ten, they didn't lose their most important guy, which is Juwan Morgan. And I think unlike anybody else in the Big Ten, they're bringing in an obvious, immediate impact player. So, like as with Wisconsin, I think that projection is a best case. I doubt even Indiana fans are projecting them to be much more than a top 20 team at this point, but I think it's definitely a realistic possibility.
Well, Bart, we really appreciate you taking the time, really appreciate your insight. Again, the website is barttorvik.com, BARTTORVIK.com, and we'll have a link to that in the show notes, as well as a link to your Twitter feed, which we also recommend that people follow. But thank you so much for coming on the show and providing your insight.
Thank you. It was fun. Anytime.
Is there any other place that would be good for people to connect with you besides those two, besides the site and Twitter?
Nope. That's my online presence in a nutshell, I think.
Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you, Bart, and hopefully we can bring you back on the show sometime soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Podcast on the Brink. We always appreciate you being here. To get more from me and from Alex, visit assemblycall.com and insidethehall.com for complete coverage of Indiana University basketball. If you liked this episode, please consider sharing it with a friend or family member who loves IU basketball as much as you do. You can also support the show by leaving a rating and review on iTunes, which helps us get the word out to more IU fans like yourself. We will be back next week with a new episode. Until then, as always, go Hoosiers.